Hi, everybody. I'm Brittany Lewis, a breaking news reporter here at Forbes. Joining me now is Texas-based immigration attorney Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch. Kate, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks for having me.
President Trump, in his second term, vowed to make immigration a top priority. And the case we're discussing today, some have argued this shows just how hardline President Trump's immigration stance is. Others have said that this is a constitutional crisis. And the case we're discussing today is Kilmar Abrego Garcia. He's a man who lived in Maryland, but he was born in El Salvador. He came into the country illegally in 2011, and in 2019, an immigration judge ruled that he could not be deported back to El Salvador because he faced gang violence there. Last month, he was deported to El Salvador, and he's currently being held in a prison there. Initially, the Trump administration said that he was mistakenly deported. Now they're saying that he's affiliated with the gang MS-13. What is your response to this case and what has been unfolding?
It's so upsetting. This case is really it's rocked the nation, as you say, for a reason, because he was mistakenly deported. Kilmar got withholding of removal, which is something that's like asylum. And I've done lots of these cases before immigration judges in court. And what happens is you go before the judge, there's a DHS attorney, you present evidence, you bring maybe expert witnesses, you get cross-examined, and the judge issues a ruling in a court that says, in his case, it is unsafe for him to be sent back to El Salvador. He cannot be sent back to El Salvador. So the fact that he was picked up and sent to El Salvador is in violation of our own court ruling. And it also is sending him back to the country and the prison where the people who were persecuting him are being held. So it's sending him directly into the mouth of the danger from which we ordered him to be protected. And so that in and of itself is concerning. But what I think is even more upsetting to people who are watching this is the response of the Trump administration, because this is a case where the federal courts have stepped in. A lower federal court judge very clearly required them to bring him home. The Supreme Court issued a decision. I'm sure we can get into all of that. But what's come out of this is that the Trump administration has begun to defy the federal judiciary. And that is the constitutional crisis that everyone has been waiting and watching for.
I want to talk about the withholding of removal status. I mean, what specifically does that mean? Does that mean he has asylum for good? Does that mean he can be deported anywhere else except El Salvador? Is that full citizenship? I mean, what does that look like? What are his rights there when it comes to that status?
So that's a great question, and it's something that a lot of people are getting wrong out there in the reporting and people don't understand. So withholding of removal is like asylum in the sense that you have to prove you've been persecuted on account of a protected ground, like your race, your religion, your nationality, your political opinion, your membership in a particular social group. And as I mentioned, you have to go before a judge. It's very hard to prove. But withholding of removal does not contain the same protections that asylum does, which is lifelong assurance that you will be in the United States. Someone who has withholding, like Kilmar, theoretically could be deported to a third country. That doesn't happen very often. Most third countries don't want to receive people who have gotten protection. But, theoretically, he could have been sent to, I don't know, Panama or Mexico or just some other country. But the issue in his case is that El Salvador was the one place where he could not be returned under this law, under the court order. And that was the one place where we sent him. And not only that, we didn't just send him to the country of El Salvador. We sent him into CCOT, which is this prison for gang members who are the very gang members from whom he fled. So we sent him directly into the spot where he was the most vulnerable. And all of the evidence that anyone has seen indicates that he is not a gang member, that it's actually quite the opposite. And the Trump administration will say, in the media that he's a gang member and he's a terrorist, but the federal court has repeatedly asked them for evidence and proof of this, and they're refusing to share it. So to me, that's an indication that they don't have it.
And CCOT, as you mentioned, the prison in El Salvador where he is known for human rights violations. And this case made its way up to the Supreme Court. I want to talk about that. First, the federal judge in Maryland ruled that the Trump administration has to, quote, facilitate and effectuate Garcia's return. And these words are where people are getting hung up because the Supreme Court then ruled in a 9-0 ruling that the Trump administration has to facilitate his return, but they got hung up on the effectuate word. The Supreme Court said that the word effectuate has to be defined, quote, with due regard for the deference owed to the executive branch in the conduct of foreign affairs. What do you make of the Supreme Court's ruling? Because we will get into this, but both sides are claiming victory over this.
Yes, and I think, the Supreme Court wasn't as clear as they should have been in this decision. So it was a unanimous decision. And when I initially read the decision, I felt so much relief flood through me that the Supreme Court was going to stand up to this action by the Trump administration. And it was within 12 hours of that order that the Trump administration began to claim a victory. And I started to realize that, they're going to spin this. They're going to use this sort of question about what it means to effectuate a return and simply not take action. But I think then what took it sort of over the top was the press conference when Trump invited President Bukele, and they just blatantly stated, we're not trying. We are not trying to bring him back. And then, so now even though the Supreme Court decision was somewhat vague or it left open questions about what it means to effectuate a return, it's obvious they're not even facilitating a return. So it's now back down at the lower court. The lower court just yesterday issued a really scathing rebuke of the Trump administration. So we're now, I think, going to see all of this play out again in federal court. My hope and expectation is that this round, the judiciary will be more clear in their words to the Trump administration, and then we'll really see whether the Trump administration is willing to outright defy a clear judicial order from the Supreme Court that cannot be sort of spun one way or the other.
To your point, El Salvador's president in the White House said that he doesn't have the power to bring back Garcia. He actually said that would be like smuggling a terrorist back into the United States. White House Deputy Chief of Staff of Policy Stephen Miller then said that, hey, this 9-0 ruling from the Supreme Court is a victory for the Trump administration. They're effectively saying that foreign policy decisions rest with the president. What do you make of that interpretation of what the Supreme Court said? Do you think the Supreme Court, from what you're saying, it sounds like they inadvertently left some vagueness and the Trump administration is really cracking that wide open?
I think that that's right. But I also think Miller's interpretation in that press conference and what the Trump administration is saying is a laughable interpretation of this court order. It is absolutely not a win for the Trump administration. The Supreme Court clearly said the administration needs to facilitate the return of this man. And then for Bukele to say, he used the word preposterous in the press conference, that it would be preposterous for him to try to bring back Kilmar to the United States when the highest court of our land has ordered the president to facilitate his return. And one would expect that in that moment where Bukele is saying it's preposterous, I can't smuggle a terrorist, that the president should have said in that moment, actually, we are willing to receive him. We are willing to facilitate this man's return. But instead, Trump turned to Miller, who went on to spin and I would say just lie about what the Supreme Court decision said. And that's why I think at this round, at the lower courts, presumably back up to the Supreme Court, I would expect the Supreme Court not to take too kindly to the spin on their order and to be more clear in their rebuke against the Trump administration's actions and refusal to follow their order.
What do you think the Supreme Court can and will do? I mean, what are their next steps here?
So they can order, for example, all of the deportations abroad to stop, all of the deportations, period, to stop until due process is given to each individual. So they can really gum up the works of the deportation machine of the Trump administration. So they have some, tools in their arsenal to really mess with the efforts of the Trump administration to deport people. Now, the constitutional crisis that I think is looming that everyone's considering is, okay, once the Supreme Court is so clear that their decision cannot be spun, then the Trump administration will have a decision. Are we going to follow the law of the land, or are we going to just defy a clear order? And that would be the moment where the checks and balances of our nation disintegrate. And that would be an unprecedented thing. We've actually never seen that before in our nation's history, where one branch of the government just completely defies another in our system of checks and balances.
There is an argument that he, and by he I mean Garcia, came into the country illegally. He committed a crime that way. He has the status of withholding of removal, as you and I talked about. I want to talk about due process here. Is he granted due process? I mean, what does that look like? I thought, according to the Constitution, everyone in the United States has due process. What do you say?
Absolutely not. There was no due process for him. He was just picked up off the street with his 5-year-old citizen child in the car and sent again directly to the place where he was at risk, where we had ordered he not be sent. Now, if he had been, sent a letter and said, you need to depart this country to a third nation, here's an example. I've had withholding of removal clients, and I've advised them to write the embassies of other countries and ask if they can go to those countries, to make some efforts to go elsewhere. It's not the United States. All of that, would have been on the table, right? As in terms of due process. But what they did was they detained him without notice, and they deported him without notice to a prison that has no sentence. So they sent him without a criminal conviction into a place that is a jail that has no end. So that, I think, is something really noteworthy for all of us to just reflect on. All of the Venezuelans and the people who are being sent to this prison in El Salvador, we're not just deporting these people. We're sending them into a lifelong prison sentence. And so, no, he had no due process, zero whatsoever. And I think what's scary about that is that if they can pick him up off the street and deport him into a lifelong prison sentence in another country without due process, who's next? And really, nobody should feel safe if this is allowed to go on, truly.
I think that's the slippery slope everyone's thinking, that this really opens an unprecedented can of worms of who's next to just be, because the Trump administration initially said this was a mistake, and now they're really digging their heels in. Garcia has a work permit. His wife is a citizen. His children are citizens. As you said, because of his status, let's say he comes back to the United States. The Trump administration said, we're going to deport him if he steps on U.S. soil to a third country. If he goes to a third country, does he ever have the opportunity to come back? What's been your experience with this status?
Probably not legally. I mean, he could potentially work through a case. Maybe his wife could petition for him and he could seek a waiver, for his removal. So I said no. I think there are ways that he could, pursue a re-entry legally through his marriage to a U.S. citizen. And I think the Trump administration could, if he is sent back to the United States, detain him and attempt to remove him to a third country. Now, whether they get permission to send him elsewhere is another question, and they can't detain him indefinitely here without a criminal conviction while they look to send him to a third nation. So there's a lot to come, but let's start with bringing him back, and we'll see where we go from there. I know right now some U.S. congressmen and senators are going down to El Salvador to see if they can meet with Bukele, to see if they can even ascertain how Abrego Garcia is doing. We don't know. No one knows actually if he's even alive at this moment. So they're attempting to get that information and bring him home. And then what happens next? I'm sure it'll be a hard-fought battle for him to be out of detention and finally free with his family.
As we get more developments in this case, I hope you can come on and break them down with me. But I'm curious, from your perspective here as an immigration attorney, what are some of the broader implications of this moment?
As you mentioned, the can of worms, the slippery slope, now this is the moment of all of the other moments and things that have occurred since January 20th. This case is the test case for due process, the rule of law in the United States, the checks and balances, the health of our democracy. This is the moment where we see if the executive branch is willing to follow the law. And so if they don't, then what comes next is they pick the next group, and then the next group, and then the journalists, and then the lawyers, and then, any of us could end up in a Salvadoran prison. And that's a pretty scary prospect.
Well, there's certainly a lot to look out for in this case, and I hope you come back on with me and provide and share your insight on those developments. Kate Lincoln-Goldfinch, thank you so much for joining me. You are welcome back anytime.
Thanks, Brittany. It's good to talk to you.